When you think of the most important aircraft in the Vietnam War, a lot of people picture something a little bit like this. But in reality, it's actually a little more like this, the Douglas A4 Skyhawk. You see, in the 1950s, Douglas Aircraft was looking for a replacement for the A1 Skyraider, which was in its own right a very important aircraft. But they needed something for the jet age, and they came up with this. The A4 Skyhawk being small and compact, her wingspan only 27 feet, enough to fit on an aircraft carrier without even foldable wings. But don't let its diminutive size fool you. This aircraft dropped some of the most ordnance in the entirety of the Vietnam War. In fact, the A4 Skyhawk very well could have dropped the first ordnance and the last ordnance of the war and became the primary attack aircraft of the United States Navy. Of course, being a jet, even with its small size, it could carry a lot of ordnance. It could carry a multitude of different types of munitions, rockets, bombs, and even nuclear ordnance. A4s routinely carried nuclear ordnance in the event of a nuclear war. Today on our tour, we'll be going from front to back, going over different parts of the A4 and talking about what's important, all the while showing historical footage so that you can see what it really looked like in service. During the Vietnam War, the A4 Skyhawk, as I said, carried out most of the strike rates for the United States Navy. Because she was so small, she was super maneuverable and could do certain maneuvers that other aircraft just couldn't, although the A4 was not without loss. Multiple A4s were shot down during Vietnam and many people were taken prisoner of war, the most famous of which would be Senator John McCain, who later on went on to have an illustrious political career. Before boarding the A4, pilots would don a harness like this. This is an MA1 harness, and what this does is straps you into the seat itself and equips your parachute. The parachute is built into the seat because it's a ballistic type, meaning that it will actually fire the parachute away from you to open up quicker. This allows you to parachute theoretically from 0 knots and 0 feet, being a 0-0 seat. That would be a very risky maneuver, but technically the seat was capable of it. The A4 Skyhawk had quite a large boarding ladder, which made getting in and out quite easy. The cockpit as well, while not very comfortable, was made for pilots that were kind of small. The A4 Skyhawk, of course, being an attack aircraft, has controls for weapons on board. This center panel right here that we're looking at has all of the station selectors and ordnance arming. That is where you can arm the guns, ordnance, and select which stations you choose to fire, be it rockets, napalm, bombs, or a nuclear bomb. You'll see rather interestingly that the A4 has a JATO arm and off. That is because the A4 could be equipped with a JATO rocket. You can see indicators for your flap positions, and of course your emergency landing gear pull and your normal landing gear selector. On the right side are all of your seat control, seat up and down, and of course your radios, as well as your light settings. Of course in the center are your main avionics, your weapon selectors, and of course the stick you use to fly the airplane. Sitting in the A4 cockpit is always interesting. This particular A4, being from the Collings Foundation, has a couple upgrades to make it drivable in the modern world because this jet does still fly. In fact, I've personally flown this jet a single time. It does have, of course, a modern GPS and a modern Garmin G5, but the rest of the avionics are as you would find them in the Vietnam War. Additionally, there's a gun sight in the very front, and the same control stick with the same controls from the war. In the canopy, the A4 also has several mirrors to see behind you, and of course a clock, so you can do instrument procedures. This A4, being a training A4, of course has a back seat where an instructor would sit. It's much the same as the front seat, with slightly abbreviated avionics. We're now under the A4, which sits rather high. I can't stand up all the way, but it sits high because it's a carrier aircraft. It needs to be tall, so its suspension can clear the ordnance and of course compress upon the hard landings on an aircraft carrier. You can see the large centerline ordnance pylon. This is what would carry a nuclear bomb in the event of a nuclear war. Other than that, there are several stations along the aircraft, and of course, there were still the Colt Mark 12s. These are 20mm cannons. And there would have been one on either side. We only have the one with the receiver on this side. The A4 had a rather far combat range, but of course to supplant that could carry these large 300-gallon external drop tanks. It could carry several of them, and of course, despite being very heavy, of course gave you a lot of gas. The wing of the A4 being so short needs a couple aerodynamic devices to help it get enough lift. It has forward slats that are aerodynamically operated to give it a lower stall speed, and it also has vortex generators running most of the wing to again lower that stall speed. The A4 had extremely effective ailerons, allowing it to have a roll rate up to 720 degrees per second, which is absolutely mind-boggling. Additionally, it had these large split flaps here from the aileron inboard, and this gave it again that low speed it needed for carrier approaches. When we fly the A4 here, it has a VREF or landing speed of about 150 knots. The A4 Skyhawk is of course equipped with a speed brake to allow you to slow down in flight, and also a tailhook for those carrier landings. The exhaust of the A4, despite being somewhat small, still puts out a rather impressive amount of thrust. The A4 Skyhawk was equipped with multiple different engine variants. Originally the J65 from Wright, and from the A4E forwards, the Pratt & Whitney J52. A very impressive model was available with the 408 engine that gave it a significant amount of thrust. Most of them, though, had the J52A, P8A, and P8B. The A4 Skyhawk served valiantly in Vietnam. One man, Michael J. Estesit, earned the Medal of Honor posthumously in the A4 Skyhawk. Despite being shot down, he of course saved many lives in the suppression of air defenses in his A4 Skyhawk. After the war, many people forgot about the A4. In fact, the United States Navy relegated the A4 to more of a training role. The Navy and Marine Corps used it to train for many years, and it would later make an appearance in Top Gun, both the movie and the actual school. Because the A4 was so maneuverable, it made a good surrogate for the MiG-17. This maneuverability made it great for chasing down people in F-14s. That's why you would later see an A4 Skyhawk in the movie Top Gun. And of course, it really served at the real school. The United States Marine Corps would use the A4 for a multitude of reasons, of course being attack and training, and they would use the A4 for many years. Interestingly, after the war, several countries took the A4 as a relatively cheap and easy to use aircraft. Impressively, the Argentinian Navy used the A4 to fight a much superior military, the British Royal Navy. They had Harriers, of course, and by all accounts were better aircraft, but they managed to actually do some damage with their A4s. Israel used the A4 in various conflicts in the Middle East. They called their A4 the Ayit, which means eagle in Hebrew, and they also had a very highly modified version of the A4 with an upgraded avionics hump and a lot more power. That A4 was what would widely be considered the ultimate A4. Israel would last use their A4s in combat operations as recently as 2012 when they dropped leaflets over Gaza. The entire fleet was retired in 2015, which was not that long ago. That's under a decade ago for the last A4s that they used in active service. Thank you all very much for watching the video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this tour of the A4 Skyhawk. It's one of the most important aircraft of all time, and certainly one of the most important of the Vietnam War, and I hope that it did it justice. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and share it if you think someone would be interested in the A4. This particular one will always be sentimental to me because it's the very first jet I ever flew. You guys have a good night.